January 1945. The war in Europe is freezing itself still. Snow lies crusted over a field near Andernach, where rows of barbed wire enclose thousands of German prisoners. Smoke curls from a small wooden barrack at the edge of the camp, an American field kitchen, its stovepipe pulsing against the white sky. Inside, heat fogs the air. Flour dust drifts like snowfall around a lone U.S. Army cook kneading dough on a scarred table. His hands move methodically, steady as the ticking of the wall clock. Outside, a group of captured officers stand, watching through the wire. Their greatcoats are torn, their gloves gone. One, still wearing the faded insignia of a panzer regiment, stares as the smell of baking bread rolls across the snow. For months he has eaten only cold barley and thin soup. The scent makes his knees tremble. When the loaf finally emerges, crusted, golden, the cook slices it open and places a piece on a tin tray before the prisoners. The German colonel hesitates, voice hoarse. "You cook for enemies?" The American wipes flour from his palms. "No," he says simply, "for men." By the winter of 1944 to 1945, the Western Front was collapsing, but the war did not end neatly. It folded in on itself. As the Battle of the Bulge faded and the Allied armies pressed east, streams of surrendering German soldiers began to flood the roads of Belgium and France. In a matter of weeks, the U.S. Army faced a paradox it had never planned for. Victory measured not in captured cities, but in mouths to feed. Tens of thousands became hundreds of thousands. Within a few months, more than 2 million German prisoners were in American custody, scattered across Europe. Their rifles were gone, but their hunger remained a weapon of chaos. Logistics officers quickly realized that a prison camp could collapse faster than a battlefield. Men could riot from starvation just as easily as from ideology. And so, in the same breath that Eisenhower's staff drew up plans for the final drive toward the Rhine, the Quartermaster Corps drafted menus. Bread, coffee, barley, potatoes, these now had to move with the same precision as artillery shells. For every convoy that rolled east with ammunition, another followed behind with flour. The Geneva Convention of 1929 required signatories to feed prisoners at least equal in quantity and quality to rations of depot troops. The United States took that obligation seriously, not merely out of legalism, but out of identity. American leadership viewed humane treatment as proof of the civilization they claimed to defend. "How we handle them," wrote General George Marshall, "will measure what we are." Feeding enemies, therefore, became not mercy, but policy, an assertion that democracy could afford decency even when surrounded by ruin. In the frozen fields of France and the Rhine Valley, the practical work fell to the Army Service Forces. These were the quiet soldiers, truck drivers, bakers, and cooks whose battles were fought against time, weather, and arithmetic. They set up kitchens inside barns, railway depots, and prefabricated huts, hauling in sacks of flour from Normandy ports. Each oven could turn out 800 loaves a day if the temperature held and fuel arrived. When it didn't, men burned fence posts to keep the dough rising. A single bakery company might supply food for 20,000 prisoners and the American guards who watched them. Feeding one meant feeding all. Starvation could not be selective. Many frontline troops resented it. Letters home from riflemen in the Ardennes asked why the men who had shelled them now ate American bread while they themselves lived on K rations. Commanders replied with blunt arithmetic. Hungry prisoners required more guards. Fed prisoners worked, built roads, and buried the dead. A full stomach was a security measure. But underneath the pragmatism lay something older and quieter. A belief that victory had to look different from vengeance. To starve an enemy already beaten would blur the moral boundary the Allies claimed as their cause. The captured Germans arrived in every condition imaginable. Some were Wehrmacht regulars who surrendered in orderly columns. Others were teenagers pulled from the Volkssturm, barefoot and dazed. By regulation, all were processed through PWTEs, prisoner of war temporary enclosures, vast barbed wire fields ringed by watchtowers. They were given numbered tags, medical checks, and the same rations issued to U.S. garrison troops: bread, potatoes, meat or fish, vegetables, and coffee substitute. The first meal often produced disbelief. "Too good for us," one diary recorded at Rheinberg. "They feed us like guests, not captives." Another noted the detail that astonished them most, not the quantity of food, but its warmth. Even at dawn, the Americans insisted on serving it hot. That insistence demanded an army of cooks. Every division maintained field bakery and kitchen units. Each could deploy within hours of capturing new ground. They built ovens from salvaged bricks and steel drums, stoked with gasoline burners that hissed through the night. The bread they baked was coarse but fresh, its smell carrying across the wire fences into the prisoner compounds. For Germans raised on ration cards and ersatz flour, that smell was both torment and proof of another world's endurance. Feeding the enemy also required precision accounting. Each prisoner needed roughly 3,000 calories per day to maintain health in cold weather. Multiply that by 2 million, and the number dwarfed the daily intake of the entire U.S. Third Army. Yet the Quartermaster Corps met the demand. Freight trains from Le Havre and Cherbourg ran day and night carrying wheat, lard, and powdered milk. Military police guarded shipments as carefully as ammunition convoys. At the docks, Red Cross inspectors counted crates to certify compliance with international law. To the Americans, transparency itself was a weapon, proof that their moral order functioned even in chaos. Across the Atlantic, newspapers printed photographs of captured German officers eating American bread. Some readers felt pride, others outrage. Editorials argued that the same ovens feeding prisoners could have warmed refugees or liberated towns. Yet public opinion shifted as images of emaciated Allied prisoners liberated from German camps reached home. The contrast was unbearable and clarifying. Cruelty had become the enemy's creed. Humanity would be the Allies' reply. By early spring 1945, the system had stabilized. Each POW camp operated like a small city: mess halls, infirmaries, bakeries, and water towers laid out with military geometry. American cooks wore aprons over their uniforms, mixing dough beside captured enemy bakers pressed into service. In some camps, Germans themselves baked under supervision, the rhythm of kneading and rising returning a faint sense of normalcy. But in others, like the compound near Andernach, the kitchen remained firmly American. Its smells a daily reminder that the world had tilted, that power now wore generosity as its uniform. Out of that furnace of logistics emerged moments of quiet astonishment, like the one that opened our story. An American camp cook, sleeves rolled, serving bread to men who had bombed cities and burned nations. To the prisoners it was incomprehensible. To the cook it was procedure. Yet in that exchange, the giving of warmth where hatred was expected, the war's boundaries shifted from moral argument to moral demonstration. And that is where the story deepens. How a rule-book order turned into an act of grace, and how bread itself became a language spoken between captor and captive. By early 1945, the act of feeding prisoners had evolved from necessity into ideology. Every steaming pot, every loaf of bread drawn from a field oven, stood as a silent argument against the world that Germany had built. To the American command, the war was no longer just about victory. It was about vindication. They were determined to show, in small and measurable ways, what civilization looked like when it refused to imitate its enemy. For years, reports had filtered out of Europe describing Allied prisoners inside German stalags, starved, beaten, their rations thin and cold. The photographs from camps like Stalag 7A, found later by liberating troops, showed hollow eyes and skeletal limbs. News of the forced marches across snow in January 1945 had spread through every U.S. division. Many soldiers knew someone who had died on one. And yet, when the tables turned, the order from Eisenhower's Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force was explicit. Prisoners will be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention, no deviation. It was not simply policy, it was principle under observation. Red Cross inspectors arrived weekly. European journalists recorded camp conditions. The Allies wanted the world to see the contrast. At first, the captured Germans could not believe it. Interrogation reports noted confusion more than gratitude. "They thought we would let them starve," one American captain wrote. "They asked if we meant to fatten them for propaganda." Many had been raised on Nazi doctrine depicting the Allies as barbarians without honor. When the food arrived, hot, sufficient, and predictable, it disoriented them. The collapse of that myth was itself a kind of defeat. The smell of coffee, the sight of guards sharing cigarettes, all signaled something far more destabilizing than gunfire: normalcy. American cooks, many of them draftees with no illusions of glory, became the unexpected diplomats of that normalcy. They cooked not to win hearts, but to maintain order. Yet in the rhythm of serving and eating, something human emerged. Prisoners began to volunteer for kitchen duty. They learned to bake with U.S. flour, discovering that American wheat rose differently, sweeter, lighter. Some scribbled recipes to take home if they survived the war. The kitchen, built for control, became a classroom of reconstruction. The Army's own reports began to describe this phenomenon as moral conditioning. By offering predictable food and fair treatment, the Americans created an atmosphere where discipline came from cooperation, not fear. Officers who had once commanded divisions now lined up with privates for their ration trays. Bread erased rank more effectively than punishment. It was the Allies' quiet re-education program, accomplished not through ideology, but through the ordinary dignity of being fed. In contrast, Axis-run camps throughout the war had weaponized hunger. Starvation was a deliberate instrument of power, a means to break will. The Americans refused that inheritance. They replaced fear with routine. Psychologists later studying the POW system noted that men respond to structure as much as to ideology. A regular meal schedule, a fair portion, and the absence of humiliation created obedience where violence might have bred rebellion. Bread had become behavioral control, civilization's subtle weapon. Inside Germany itself, as Allied forces advanced, liberated prisoners, Russians, Poles, French, encountered captured Germans eating the same rations as their liberators. The spectacle confused everyone. Why feed the men who caused the hunger? War correspondents posed the same question to field commanders, and the answer rarely changed. Because they are prisoners, not corpses. It was a moral boundary drawn in flour instead of blood. The practice carried propaganda value as well. Leaflets dropped over retreating Wehrmacht units included lines promising fair food and treatment under Geneva Convention. Surrender, the Allies implied, meant survival, even dignity. Many German units surrendered intact because they believed that promise. The quartermaster's ability to deliver calories became a psychological front line. Feeding the enemy hastened the end of the war. But there was another reason, less strategic and more spiritual. American soldiers, many descended from immigrants themselves, understood hunger. Their grandparents had fled famines. Their parents survived the Depression. Food was identity, and to deny it, even to an enemy, felt wrong. The camp cooks understood that, instinctively. They had seen what starvation looked like in liberated towns. The hollow children, the ovens. To starve a man now, even one in uniform, was to flirt with the same darkness. In that sense, the American kitchens along the Rhine were acts of defiance, not against the enemy, but against hatred itself. Flour became forgiveness. Bread became proof that civilization could endure war without losing its humanity. From these kitchens came stories that would outlast the noise of victory, of guards who shared meals with their captives, of German officers who trembled not from cold, but from confusion at kindness. Those moments would become the quiet heart of what soldiers later called kitchen diplomacy. Small, everyday acts that rebuilt the moral world long before the peace treaties were signed, and it is within those acts, the hiss of a stove, the slice of a loaf, that our next chapter begins. The human angles behind policy, the cooks, the captives, and the unseen power of nourishment in war. The logistics of humanity. Feeding 2 million enemy soldiers required the same precision as moving an army. Every camp kitchen was a small factory, every baker a logistician. The quartermaster corps calculated not just calories but miles, how far a loaf could travel before it hardened, how long potatoes could last without sprouting. Rail cars lined the depots at Le Havre and Cherbourg, stacked floor to ceiling with wheat and canned meat. Each sack of flour bore a stenciled eagle and the words U.S. Army property, a quiet guarantee that even enemies would not starve under that emblem. Rations for German POWs were technically identical to those of American garrison troops, about 3,000 calories per day. The difference lay only in variety. Prisoners received less sugar and coffee, more barley and vegetables. Delivering that fairness demanded convoys guarded against theft, bakeries guarded against sabotage, and a moral guard against fatigue. A sergeant overseeing a bakery near Chartres wrote in his logbook, "We bake for men who shelled Paris. Still, the dough rises." The work stripped war of its slogans and left only arithmetic. Tons of grain turned into loaves, hate turned into heat. The logistical achievement astonished visiting Red Cross observers. They expected meager rations. Instead, they found menus, schedules, and inspection charts pinned beside ovens. The Americans treated food as infrastructure, not charity. In doing so, they redefined efficiency as compassion measured in weight and time. Civilization, it turned out, could be expressed in tonnage. The moral weapon. To the American command, food was not only sustenance, but strategy. Every warm meal served behind barbed wire told a story louder than propaganda broadcasts. Democracy feeds even those who fought to destroy it. In a world scarred by starvation camps, that message carried the moral gravity of a flag. Psychological warfare units recognized the effect quickly. They recorded interrogations where German prisoners compared their treatment to that of Allied captives in the Reich. "We expected revenge," one officer admitted, "but we were given soup." The intelligence analysts noted a measurable shift. Cooperation improved after the first hot meal. Information flowed more freely when a man's hands stopped shaking from hunger. The simplest humanitarian act doubled as intelligence work. But the moral weight went deeper. Feeding the enemy became proof that Allied ideals were not abstract words carved into documents, but practical acts performed in mud. The U.S. Army's chaplain service framed it bluntly in sermons to troops. Mercy is strength that refuses imitation. Every ladle of stew was an assertion that cruelty had limits, and those limits defined victory more sharply than any front line. For German soldiers conditioned by years of propaganda, kindness disoriented. The offer of bread where punishment was expected forced a reckoning with everything they had been told. Some wept openly, others could not meet the cook's eyes. "They kill us softly," one SS prisoner murmured, not in sarcasm, but in awe. The Americans had discovered a weapon more potent than fear: decency. The cook's story. He was not a hero in uniformed legend. His name rarely appeared in reports. Yet without him, the moral architecture of the camp would have collapsed. The American camp cook lived inside contradictions, armed with a ladle, surrounded by guards with rifles, watched by men who had burned cities. He woke before dawn, checked fuel levels, rationed flour, and fought the weather. His enemy was not ideology, but inconsistency. Rain that soaked the wood, wind that blew out the flames, shortages that tempted shortcuts. Still, he cooked. In interviews years later, former Army cooks recalled the same routine. "We didn't talk politics," one said. "We just wanted the bread to rise right." They measured morality in tablespoons, enough salt to taste human, not military. One remembered a German colonel saluting him after receiving a loaf. The gesture startled him more than any battle. "I realized," he said, "that feeding him finished the war faster than shooting ever could." These cooks understood instinctively that warmth travels faster than ideology. A hot meal changed posture, softened faces, ended defiance. When prisoners volunteered to wash pots or chop vegetables, it was less about hunger than about rejoining civilization through labor. The kitchen became neutral ground where war briefly ceased to exist. Inside those steaming huts, flour and discipline mixed into something neither side had language for. The cook's apron became a truce flag, his ladle an instrument of reconstruction. In every loaf pulled from those iron ovens was an unspoken declaration: humanity still functions even here. By spring 1945, word of these kitchens spread along the prisoner columns. Men surrendered more readily when they smelled bread on the wind. What began as logistics and law had become something spiritual, a daily liturgy of sustenance performed amid ruin. Next, we move from these human scenes to the larger frame of consequence: tonnage as destiny, deficiency as defeat, and the first shared meal between captor and captive as a quiet turning point in history. German reaction. When the bread arrived warm, disbelief often came first. Many German officers had prepared themselves for humiliation. They expected the victors to sneer, to deny them food, perhaps to let them freeze. Instead, the Americans handed them full rations, thick slices of bread, hot soup, even margarine when supply allowed. Some prisoners took the food slowly, as if expecting a trick. Others devoured it in silence. Reports from the U.S. Army's Psychological Warfare Division described a curious pattern. Captured personnel express confusion and guilt upon receiving humane treatment. The contradiction between expectation and reality shook them more than defeat itself. One Wehrmacht lieutenant captured near Remagen told his interrogator, "You treat us better in captivity than we treated our own civilians." That realization was corrosive to pride, but also cleansing. In the camp at Andernach, several high-ranking officers later requested to meet the American cook who had baked their first loaves. The man, a corporal from Kansas, stood awkwardly before them. The senior German, once decorated for command in the 2nd Panzer Division, tried to speak but could only manage. "We are not worth this." The cook shrugged. "It's not about worth," he said. "It's breakfast." That moment repeated itself across Europe. Cooks received salutes instead of arguments, handshakes instead of hostility. What had begun as routine sustenance turned into moral shock therapy. The smell of bread in those cold camps carried a message that propaganda could never erase. The war's moral center had shifted. The cultural mirror food reflected not just survival, but civilization itself. The German army had marched under the banner of discipline, order, sacrifice, denial. Hunger, in that worldview, was proof of strength. To eat well was to grow complacent. Yet, by 1945, that creed had betrayed them. Their soldiers starved, their civilians queued for turnips, their cities reeked of ration smoke. The American worldview was the mirror opposite. Abundance was not shameful. It was virtuous proof that democracy worked. A full stomach meant productivity, confidence, calm. To share food, even with an enemy, was to show command of chaos. Bread was a metaphor for everything America believed about itself: practical goodness, warmth, equality measured in slices. That difference became visible in every camp. Germans who had once mocked Allied materialism now saw its moral dimension. Efficiency turned ethical. The Americans did not worship comfort, they industrialized compassion. To them, organization was empathy made functional. A soldier feeding another soldier, no matter the flag, was not sentiment. It was procedure elevated to virtue. Post-war interviews conducted by Red Cross researchers captured this revelation vividly. One German captain said, "You Americans fight like machines, but feed like farmers. You do not hate us. You simply organize better." In his confusion lay the war's quiet verdict. Cruelty is chaos pretending to be discipline. True order nourishes. The power of bread in those final months became something larger than food. It was currency, theology, diplomacy, all at once. The loaf handed to a prisoner meant more than nourishment. It represented survival with dignity. After years of propaganda that called the enemy subhuman, to receive bread from his hand was to face humanity again. It stripped away uniform and ideology. For the Americans, the act carried its own revelation. Many cooks were young men who had seen the photographs from Buchenwald and Dachau. They had smelled the results of starvation weaponized. To them, baking for German prisoners was a kind of penance on behalf of humanity, to prove that decency could still exist in the same world that had built death camps. "We can't fix what they did," one quartermaster sergeant wrote home, "but we can make sure the next loaf smells right." Bread became a language of surrender deeper than any treaty. At Andernach and Rheinberg, prisoners began to help bake their own rations under supervision. They kneaded dough beside American cooks, trading recipes and silence. In those shared kitchens, the last wall between victors and vanquished dissolved. Each rising loaf marked a small act of reconciliation, proof that even enemies could collaborate in the universal grammar of survival. Later, when these men returned to Germany, many remembered not interrogation or discipline, but the smell of that bread. Letters archived in Bonn decades later recall it as the moment we understood what freedom meant. For them, warmth had carried more conviction than words. By the war's end, the United States had transformed the kitchen into a quiet moral theater. There were no parades for the cooks, no medals for ladles raised in steam. Yet their work spoke across decades. An empire of fear had been defeated not just by bullets and bombs, but by the simple, organized act of feeding those it once terrified. And from this silent front line of ovens and spoons came the moment that would define the story's heart, the encounter when officers trembled before a loaf of warm bread and realized that defeat could still taste of grace. By March 1945, the Western Front had fractured. Germany was still fighting, but its backbone was broken. The Rhine had become both frontier and funnel. On one bank, the last convoys of the Wehrmacht retreating east. On the other, an expanding ocean of surrender. Camps like Andernach and Remagen overflowed with tens of thousands of prisoners. The snow melted into mud, and the world smelled of smoke, sweat, and yeast. The American Eighth Army's 106th Quartermaster Bakery Company was stationed just beyond the wire. Their assignment was relentless: bake, serve, repeat. The ovens ran around the clock, fueled by gasoline burners that hissed like small jet engines. Dough rose in metal tubs stacked like barrels. A handful of cooks, some veterans, some barely trained, produced more bread per day than a European town. The numbers seemed absurd: 20,000 loaves daily, 800 per hour. Each one proofed, baked, and delivered to camps whose fences stretched beyond sight. Among the workers was Corporal John Garrett, a 26-year-old cook from Kansas City. Before the war, he'd worked in a small diner. He'd never seen Europe before, and now he was feeding the army that had tried to destroy it. Garrett had no time for reflection. His orders were simple: maintain output, keep sanitation high, no delays. But every time he opened the oven, he felt the wave of heat roll across the frozen air, and beyond the barbed wire, he could see faces, dozens, hundreds, watching. The German prisoners arrived in droves: paratroopers, engineers, medics, clerks. Many were little more than teenagers. Others were officers who still stood stiffly, pretending to command men who no longer existed. When the first bread convoy reached the compound, guards organized lines by rank, discipline enforced through exhaustion. The smell spread faster than the ration trucks. Witnesses recalled that entire crowds fell silent as the first baskets were carried inside, an aroma no one had felt for months. Garrett and his team wheeled in trays of golden loaves, steam escaping in ribbons. The guards distributed them, one slice per man, and the Germans handled each piece with reverence. Some pressed the bread to their faces as if testing whether it was real. A few crossed themselves. Others wept openly. Standing apart from the crowd were 5 captured officers, decorated veterans from the 2nd Panzer and 352nd Infantry Divisions. Their boots were still polished, their coats immaculate, despite captivity. They'd refused to eat for 2 days, insisting they'd take food only from German kitchens. But hunger makes philosophers of us all. When the loaves arrived, the smell overwhelmed them. The senior among them, Colonel Friedrich Albrecht, stepped forward, thin and gray, his once square shoulders trembling. "You bake this for us?" he asked in halting English. Garrett wiped his hands on a towel, unsure if he was allowed to speak. "Yes, sir," he said finally. "For prisoners?" "For whoever's here." Albrecht stared down at the bread, at the soft white interior glistening with butter. He had commanded men in Russia who had frozen to death clutching crumbs. Now his enemy served him warmth. The contradiction broke something inside him. "You cook for enemies?" he whispered, voice barely audible. Garrett hesitated, searching for a word that fit both order and decency. "We cook for men," he said quietly. "The war's up to somebody else." One of the other officers laughed softly, then covered his face. It wasn't mockery. It was the laughter of disbelief, of surrender to something deeper than defeat. They accepted the bread as if it were sacrament. Nearby, an American MP watched the exchange and later wrote in his report, "They trembled like they'd never been warm before." That evening, as the camp lights glowed across the Rhine, the ovens continued to burn. German POWs who had once sneered at Allied decadence volunteered to help bake. Their discipline, once militarized obedience, transformed into efficiency of another kind. The kitchen became the most orderly place in the camp. Men spoke softly, almost respectfully, in 2 languages that rarely needed translation. A nod meant gratitude. The passing of a loaf meant peace. Word spread among prisoners that the Americans fed without hate. "They have no revenge," one diarist wrote. "They fight with bread." For men raised to see mercy as weakness, that realization was unbearable and liberating. The same system that had fed their captors in battle now fed them in captivity, proving a truth the Reich had denied. Power and cruelty were not the same thing. Later that week, Red Cross inspectors recorded that morale among POWs at Andernach was unexpectedly stable. No riots, no protests. The camp's bakery was cited as the primary factor. When asked why, the interpreter translated the prisoner's explanation into a single line: "They feed us like men, not animals." For Garrett, the event blurred into routine. He never spoke of it afterward, except once, years later, when a reporter asked if he remembered baking bread for the Germans. "Sure," he said, eyes lowered. "They looked hungry." I didn't think about politics. It just seemed like the right thing to do. That was the point. Civilization isn't declared. It's performed, sometimes with nothing more than dough, fire, and conscience. The ovens at Andernach would keep burning for months, long after the front lines disappeared. But their true fire was moral, proof that victory meant more than survival. Next comes the second part of the climax, how that single act of decency rippled outward, changing the behavior of captors and captives alike as Europe collapsed and rebuilt itself around the quiet strength of a loaf of bread. The story of that morning in Andernach did not end with the breaking of bread. Within days, the gesture had rippled through the camp's chain of command. Prisoners who had once slumped listlessly against the wire began lining up in orderly silence at mealtime. Guards reported fewer fights, fewer escape attempts, fewer suicides. Hunger had kept them feral. Food made them human again. Word spread between camps, Rheinberg, Bad Kreuznach, Heilbronn, that the Americans were feeding even the officers, that the bread was real and fresh, not the gray sawdust loaves of wartime Germany. Some prisoners refused to believe it until convoys arrived at their own gates, trucks smelling of yeast and diesel. The ovens at Andernach became legend. The bakery where the war ended without a shot. For the Americans, it was efficiency. For the Germans, revelation. Inside the wire, discipline reassembled itself spontaneously. The former sergeants and corporals organized work details, volunteered to clean barracks, dig latrines, and repair fences. They did not do it out of obedience to the captors, but out of gratitude for the food that arrived like clockwork. We became soldiers again, one POW recalled, not ghosts waiting to die. Colonel Friedrich Albrecht, the officer who had first questioned the cook, changed most visibly. He had once forbidden his men to work for the enemy. A week after the bread incident, he asked permission to inspect the camp bakery. Garrett let him in. The colonel examined the mixers, the sacks of American flour, the precise rows of loaves cooling on racks. "It is the smell," he said finally, "that I will remember." Then he removed his gloves, extended his hand, and shook the cook's, a gesture between equals. That handshake became unofficial ritual. Every new batch of prisoners passing through Andernach received bread first, questions later. The camp's chaplain began calling it communion without a church. The phrase spread among the guards, then to headquarters, where officers noted the unprecedented calm in the facility's weekly reports. One major wrote to his superior, "We have discovered the cheapest weapon in the war, warmth." Elsewhere, the contrast between vengeance and mercy became stark. Soviet-run camps in the east starved their German captives. Thousands perished before spring. Word of those deaths filtered west, making the American camps appear not only humane, but miraculous. German families learned through Red Cross letters that their sons were alive and fed. It was the bread, one mother later wrote, that convinced us the world had not ended. At Remagen, the same moral equation played out under harsher conditions. Floods destroyed supply routes. Cold winds turned mud to ice. Yet the field kitchens refused to close. Prisoners watching Americans ladle soup under sleet began to volunteer labor to keep the stoves running. Cooperation replaced fear. It was not surrender, it was survival shared. Garrett and his men noticed the change even before command did. Prisoners began leaving small tokens by the kitchen door, carved wooden spoons, drawings of loaves, messages written in broken English. "Thank you for bread. Thank you for not hate." The cooks pinned them to the wall beside ration charts, silent reminders that compassion could be measured in ounces. In April 1945, as Allied forces crossed the Rhine and discovered the concentration camps, the news reached Andernach like a distant thunderclap. Guards and prisoners alike gathered around the radio to hear reports of starvation on a scale no one had imagined. For the German captives, shame fell heavier than shock. They stood in silence, hearing what their own system had done to others. One officer reportedly whispered, "We do not deserve even this bread." Garrett, still working at the oven, overheard. He set down the peel, walked to the fence, and said only, "Then make it mean something." He pointed to the bread. "Start from there." That night, for the first time, prisoners sang softly after curfew. Not marching songs, hymns. The music drifted over the wire and mingled with the steady hiss of the stoves. To some guards it sounded eerie. To others it sounded like the war finally exhaling. By VE Day, Andernach had become a functioning town more than a camp. Its prisoners, baked alongside Americans, repaired roads, grew vegetables, even staged a soccer match against the guards. They lost 3-1, but afterward everyone ate together. Bread passed hand to hand across the field, still warm. No speeches, no orders. Just the quiet transaction of civility returned. Years later, when German historians interviewed former POWs, they mentioned Andernach as a moral frontier, the place where they first saw democracy not as theory, but as taste and smell. "It was the bread," one wrote, "that defeated us, not the tanks." For the Americans, too, the event left an imprint. Many cooks went home changed, unable to speak of it without pause. They had entered the army to serve, not to reconcile. Yet they came to understand that feeding an enemy was the final act of war, the one that transformed victory from conquest into civilization. In archives today, the official quartermaster report for Andernach reads like an accountant's ledger. Output, 17,240 loaves. Losses, 0. But between those lines lies a quiet miracle, a moment when history pivoted not on a treaty or a bullet, but on a loaf of bread served across a fence. And when the last oven cooled, when the smell faded into the summer air, a new chapter began, the aftermath of moral logistics, how feeding enemies evolved into feeding nations. When the ovens finally cooled, the numbers spoke for themselves. Between March and August 1945, U.S. Army bakery companies across Western Europe produced over 50 million loaves of bread, most of it consumed not by Allied soldiers, but by captured Germans. It was the quietest triumph of the war, a logistical machine built to destroy, now turned to sustain. The Americans did not celebrate it. The task was too ordinary, too procedural. Quartermaster reports described output in tonnage and temperature, never in emotion. Yet within those ledgers lay the truest image of post-war victory. Food distributed to those who had been enemies yesterday and would become civilians tomorrow. The camps themselves were evolving. As Europe collapsed, each one became a laboratory for rebuilding order. At Andernach, Rheinberg, and Remagen, American officers realized that starvation was the enemy of stability. Men who ate worked. Men who worked built roads, repaired rail lines, and tended fields. The decision to feed generously was as much practical as moral. It turned POWs from burdens into laborers for reconstruction. By summer, German captives were producing food for Allied depots, harvesting crops, and even baking bread for other camps. The irony was not lost on anyone. The army that had marched under banners of conquest now toiled in kitchens for its former foes. Yet the work carried a strange dignity. As one prisoner wrote in his diary, "We earn our bread again, and so we begin to live." For these men, sustenance had become redemption. Red Cross inspectors touring the facilities documented the transformation. Their reports, filed to Geneva, described orderly camps with functioning infirmaries, bakeries, and schools. "The atmosphere is industrious," one wrote. "The prisoners appear well-fed, and morale is high. They express gratitude and confusion in equal measure." The phrase recurred across multiple visits, gratitude and confusion. It summarized the moral landscape of 1945 better than any official communique. The American Guards experienced their own conversion. They entered the camps expecting bitterness. Many had lost friends in the Bulge or Normandy. They had seen villages burned and civilians shot. Feeding the perpetrators felt, at first, like betrayal. Yet, day after day, the act of serving food stripped the poison from memory. After a while, one sergeant said, "You stop seeing uniforms. You just see ribs and hands." He paused, then added, "And you remember we were all hungry once." What began as duty became something more intimate, empathy structured by routine. The mess line equalized captor and captive. The same ladle that served the guards filled the prisoners' bowls. In that sameness, a subtle justice took shape, not retribution, but restoration. Guards and cooks alike began referring to the Germans simply as the men, a small linguistic shift that signaled a vast moral one. Meanwhile, in the towns surrounding the camps, French and Belgian civilians watched this American magnanimity with ambivalence. Their own children still queued for ration bread. Why should the occupiers eat before the occupied? Local newspapers questioned the policy, accusing the U.S. Army of Compassion misplaced. But Eisenhower's command stood firm. Feeding the prisoners, they argued, would speed Europe's recovery. "Starvation breeds chaos," wrote one staff officer. "We are trying to end war, not pause it." That logic, pragmatic yet humane, became the seed of post-war policy. Indeed, the Quartermaster Corps' success at sustaining millions of POWs became the foundation for the Allied Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, the blueprint for the Marshall Plan's later supply network. The very routes that had carried bread to camps now carried grain to cities. The war's moral logistics became peace's infrastructure. Inside the wire, the change was visible in posture. When prisoners first arrived, they had shuffled with heads bowed. By summer, they walked upright, their bodies filling out, their faces regaining color. At Andernach, daily assemblies ended with songs, folk tunes, not marches. The guards allowed it. "They sing because they're alive," Captain Robert Evans noted in his diary. That's the sound of defeat turning into civilization. Some prisoners even wrote letters of thanks to the cooks, translated by interpreters and sent through Army channels. One read, "To the men who gave us bread. You have defeated us twice, once with arms and once with kindness. The second victory hurts less, but it teaches more." Those letters circulated quietly among officers, many of whom tucked them into their service records. They became private testaments to a kind of victory that could never fit on a medal. For Corporal John Garrett, the Kansas cook whose words had started it all, "We cook for men," life after Andernach was subdued. He stayed on through August, supervising German volunteers who had taken over the bakery. On his last day, the same Colonel Albrecht, who had once trembled at the sight of bread, presented him with a gift, a hand-carved wooden breadboard etched with the words "Frieden durch Wärme," peace through warmth. Garrett accepted it without ceremony. He folded it into his duffel bag, shipped home, and never spoke publicly of the war again. But his act lingered, replicated quietly across the continent. In every camp where food replaced fear, the myth of American brutality dissolved. Post-war intelligence reports noted that German civilians approaching Allied occupation forces often cited POW treatment as proof that surrender would bring life, not vengeance. The kitchen had become diplomacy. In the ruins of cities like Cologne and Frankfurt, newly freed civilians saw trucks marked with the same insignia as those that had fed their soldiers. The connection was immediate. The power that could kill had chosen instead to feed. For many Germans, that contradiction was their first experience of democracy in practice. Meanwhile, in Washington, military historians began compiling data on POW management. They found that camps with reliable food supplies experienced 60% fewer disciplinary incidents and nearly zero escape attempts. Feeding the enemy, they concluded, was not charity. It was control by civilization. A man with a full stomach, one report read, will guard his dignity better than his anger. By autumn, when most prisoners were transferred or released, the camps left behind an invisible legacy, the idea that logistics could express morality. Each loaf, each ration tin had been a small demonstration of principle. The ovens of Andernach had baked more than bread, they had baked credibility. As Europe turned toward rebuilding, the lesson endured. The Quartermaster Corps' motto, "Supply the fight," quietly evolved into something broader. Sustain the peace. In that transition lay the true aftermath of Garrett's gesture and the millions like it. What began as a cook's answer to a prisoner's question had become a doctrine for a generation. The moral power of food did not fade when the camps emptied. It migrated outward, reshaping the very architecture of post-war Europe. By the winter of 1945-46, the same trucks that had once delivered bread to POW enclosures now rolled into shattered cities. Their routes were familiar: Le Havre to Cologne, Cherbourg to Frankfurt, Antwerp to Munich. Inside their cargo holds lay sacks stamped with a simple stencil, U.S. Army property, but their mission had changed. They no longer sustained an army, they sustained a continent. Germany was starving. Allied bombings had destroyed mills, bakeries, and rail lines. Crops rotted in frozen fields. Industrial collapse meant no flour, no yeast, no coal for ovens. In the winter darkness, families boiled grass and horse bones for broth. The American command recognized the peril. If starvation took hold, vengeance and extremism would follow. Feeding the defeated was no longer compassion. It was containment of chaos. Bread, General Lucius Clay wrote from occupied Germany, is our first weapon against despair. The logistical network forged during the war became the skeleton of peace. Quartermaster units transitioned into civilian supply branches under the newly formed Allied Control Council. Former POWs who had baked in Andernach and Remagen now labored as free men unloading flour barges along the Rhine. They wore no uniforms, but the rhythm of work felt the same: weigh, knead, bake, deliver. In some towns, American officers intentionally hired these ex-soldiers to operate local bakeries, believing that shared labor would accelerate reconciliation. The plan worked. By late 1946, nearly every major German city had at least one functioning bakery under Allied supervision. For many Germans, the smell of fresh bread became the first sign that peace was real. The image recurred in diaries and newspapers. We woke to the smell of bread, and we knew the war was over. The symbolism was universal. Bread meant order, and order meant hope. To the Allies, it was the tangible proof that democracy could feed what tyranny had starved. The psychological transformation was profound. Men who had once cursed the Americans now stood in line for rations alongside their former enemies without resentment. Civilians wrote to occupation authorities thanking them for the bread that tastes of mercy. German children began calling the GIs Schokoladensoldaten, chocolate soldiers. The myth of cruelty dissolved into the memory of warmth. In Washington and London, policymakers took note. The success of POW feeding and occupation relief shaped the emerging Marshall Plan. Economic aid, they realized, required the same structure as wartime logistics: warehouses, depots, convoys, and above all, cooks. Feeding people was easier than rebuilding economies, but it created the trust upon which Reconstruction could stand. In 1947, George Marshall's speech at Harvard echoed that principle. Our policy is directed not against any country or doctrine, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. Those words were born from the same moral arithmetic that had once guided a camp cook at Andernach. Meanwhile, in Germany, remembrance took another form. Churches and community centers erected small plaques commemorating the bread of peace. Veterans associations, once devoted to battlefield valor, now held gatherings to honor the unknown bakers and supply men of 1945. Colonel Friedrich Albrecht, living quietly near Hamburg, wrote a memoir titled Der Duft de Brot, The Smell of Bread. In it, he recounted that first encounter with Corporal Garrett and reflected, "In that moment I felt the Reich dissolve and humanity return." The book became a modest success among post-war readers searching for moral clarity amid defeat. American veterans rarely spoke publicly about the gesture. They saw no heroism in it, only decency. Yet within the U.S. Army, the Andernach story circulated quietly as a parable. Training manuals for the newly established civil affairs divisions used it as a case study in practical humanitarian leadership. The lesson was simple. Feed first, reform later. Moral authority begins with nourishment. When Garrett died in 1971, the wooden breadboard Colonel Albrecht had given him was found hanging in his kitchen, worn smooth by decades of use. The carving, Frieden durch Wärme, was faded but legible. His daughter donated it to the Quartermaster Museum at Fort Lee, Virginia, where it remains today, a small relic of a vast principle, that civilization can be proven by a loaf of bread. In post-war Europe, memory hardened into policy. The Red Cross, CARE, and UNICEF, all born or expanded in the war's aftermath, traced their logistical models to Allied POW operations. Every shipment of flour to Greece, every can of milk to Poland, echoed those early deliveries across the Rhine. Humanity, once an ideal, had become a system of transportation. Even now, historians argue about the scale of American virtue, pointing to darker episodes, the shortages, the mistakes, the chaos. But beneath those complexities lies something elemental, a moral instinct expressed through logistics. When the war ended, the ovens kept burning, and through their heat, the world learned to rebuild. And so the aftermath of Andernach stretched far beyond its wire. It became a philosophy etched into policy, remembered in scent and taste more than in speeches or treaties. A cook once told a prisoner, "We cook for men." The world, still trembling from destruction, took that sentence and built an entire piece upon it. History often remembers the noise, the roar of engines, the crash of artillery, the cheers of victory parades. But the truth of the Second World War often hides in quieter sounds, the hiss of a stove, the rustle of flour in a sack, the crack of crust when a loaf is broken in two. In those simple gestures, the moral story of the 20th century was rewritten. The ovens at Andernach and 1,000 other camps never aimed to make heroes. They produced something rarer, normalcy amid the ruins. In a Europe where cruelty had become routine, the act of feeding an enemy restored the world's most fragile resource, trust. The bread those men shared did not erase the war's crimes, but it proved that mercy could outlast them. Every empire falls when it forgets what sustains life. The Third Reich exalted strength and despised nourishment, believing hunger purified the soul. The democracies believed the opposite, that civilization begins at the table. Their victory was not just military, it was moral, measured not in the dead but in the fed. When Colonel Albrecht asked, "You cook for enemies?" he spoke for a century that had forgotten compassion. Corporal Garrett's quiet answer, "We cook for men," became the hinge between destruction and renewal. In those 5 words lay a creed stronger than any manifesto, that decency is not weakness, and that even in the aftermath of horror, humanity can choose warmth over vengeance. Decades later, visitors to the Quartermaster Museum still stop before the wooden breadboard carved with Frieden durch Wärme, peace through warmth. Its surface bears the fingerprints of time, but its message has not faded. It reminds us that the foundations of peace are built not by treaties or speeches, but by ordinary hands doing ordinary kindness at extraordinary moments. Because sometimes history turns not on a bullet or a flag, but on the quiet courage to feed the defeated.